What if I told you that one look, just one, was enough to send shockwaves through the most powerful family in Britain? That a glance, sharpened into something darker, colder, and unmistakably hostile, could change Meghan Markle's royal destiny in a single heartbeat? Think about that for a second. We've all seen moments when silence says more than words, when eyes cut deeper than any speech. But what if those eyes belonged to Meghan Markle, and they were aimed directly at Princess Anne, the no-nonsense daughter of the late Queen? What does that mean for a family already fractured by scandal, by whispers, and by betrayal? Picture it, a private meeting, the kind the palace swore would remain confidential. No cameras, no flashing lights, no smiling photo ops, just the royals themselves, behind closed doors, in a rare attempt at reconciliation. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Years of bitterness had left scars that wouldn't heal, and this was supposed to be the first step toward peace. But instead of healing, something else happened. A stare, a silent but deadly gesture that insiders now whisper about as the moment everything changed. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Now, you might be wondering, why should one stare matter? Why should we, the public, care about a look exchanged between Meghan and Princess Anne? The answer is simple. Because this wasn't just about two women. This was about power, about legacy, about a monarchy trying desperately to preserve itself in the 21st century while a duchess from Hollywood dared to rewrite the rules. That stare wasn't just personal, it was political. It was symbolic. And the fallout, as we'll uncover, may have been the final straw that convinced the royals Meghan could no longer play any role inside their carefully constructed system. But let's rewind. To truly understand the gravity of that stare, we need to explore the tension leading up to this so-called meeting of reconciliation. Picture Harry and Meghan, once hailed as the modern face of royalty, sitting across from family members who view them as the greatest threat to the institution since abdications and scandals past. On one side of the table, Meghan, polished, perfectly poised, a master of silence when it suited her. On the other, Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, famed for her sharp tongue, icy stare, and total lack of patience for drama. Two women, two forces, and one inevitable clash. And here's where the story tightens its grip. Because when Meghan's eyes cut through the room, landing squarely on Anne, the weight of history suddenly pressed in. Think of Anne's legacy. Decades of service, bluntness that brooked no nonsense, a woman who was never swayed by glamour or spin. Now contrast that with Meghan, the actress turned duchess, who entered the royal fold with Hollywood sparkle, but quickly collided with the cold steel of tradition. Their worlds were never meant to align. And when those worlds finally collided in one stare, the room froze. But why does this matter now? Because the royal family, for all its secrecy, is never truly private. The whispers from that meeting spread, slowly at first, like smoke rising through cracks in the palace walls, and then faster, until the public caught wind. The idea that Meghan's role was being questioned, not just by Charles or William, but by Anne, the unyielding royal most respected within the family, turned the narrative on its head. Suddenly, reconciliation looked like a mirage. Suddenly, the palace appeared united against Meghan in ways the public hadn't seen before. Now, think about the symbolism. We live in a world where body language is dissected endlessly. Every glance, every shrug, every handshake between royals is analyzed for meaning. So imagine the symbolism of a so-called death stare. Imagine the speculation. Was it anger? Was it contempt? Was it the final signal that Meghan was no longer welcome in the fold? The audience, the public, couldn't look away, and neither could the family in that room. And that brings us to the deeper question. What role did Meghan actually lose? Insiders whisper about subtle but significant removals, her influence in charitable projects, her ability to represent the crown, even her voice in shaping royal narratives. None of this was shouted from the rooftops. It was silent, strategic, and devastating. But the death stare became the shorthand, the symbol of that quiet purge. Now, here's where things get even darker. That look, that instant, didn't just seal Meghan's fate. It opened old wounds inside Harry. Because if his wife was being stripped of her role, humiliated by the family, what did that mean for him? Was he complicit by staying silent in that meeting? Or was he powerless, trapped between love and loyalty? That stare didn't just divide Meghan and Anne, it drove a wedge straight into Harry's heart. But let me ask you this. Have you ever been in a room where you knew someone's silence was louder than any argument? Where the way someone looked at you left you shaken, defensive, or defiant? Multiply that by 1,000, add centuries of royal tradition, and place it inside the walls of Buckingham Palace. That's the intensity we're talking about here. And yet, what's most fascinating is how the story leaked. Because remember, this was supposed to be private. But nothing in the royal family ever stays private. Whisper networks within the palace, aides with their own agendas, and the ever-hungry press turned one private moment into a narrative that spread worldwide. And as it spread, Meghan's role diminished further, piece by piece, until it was clear that this wasn't just a personal feud, it was a public power play. So let's pause. Let's sit with that image for a second. Meghan Markle, eyes locked on Princess and projecting fury, defiance, or maybe even desperation, depending on how you interpret it. A room full of royals shifting uncomfortably, some pretending not to notice, others waiting for someone to break the tension. And then, the decision, silent but swift, to push Meghan further to the margins. But here's the twist. Meghan, for all her calculated composure, may not have realized the weight of that moment until it was too late. She may not have understood that and, unlike others in the family, didn't play games. For Anne, duty was duty, and one death stare was all it took to draw the line. And that, right there, is the story we're about to unravel. A story not just of one look, but of decades of tension, centuries of tradition, and the slow, silent unraveling of Meghan Markle's role in the royal family. Because what came after that meeting, what spilled into the press, what turned whispers into headlines, would prove that sometimes the smallest gestures carry the heaviest consequences. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Reconciliation, a word that should bring comfort, peace, and resolution. But inside the walls of the monarchy, it's rarely that simple. Instead, reconciliation is often a stage, an elaborate performance played out not for healing, but for control. And the so-called private meeting that brought Meghan Markle back into the royal circle was no exception. On the surface, it was about mending bridges. In reality, it was about testing boundaries. Imagine the setting. A grand room, heavy with history. The walls lined with portraits of monarchs past, their stern faces watching silently, as if reminding every living royal of the unbreakable weight of tradition. The chairs arranged carefully, not casually, never casually. Because in the monarchy, even the seating chart is strategy. Who sits where, who enters first, who breaks the silence. All of it speaks louder than the words that follow. And on this particular day, the arrangement was meant to suggest calm neutrality. But beneath it all, tension buzzed like static in the air. Now pause here. Let me ask you, have you ever walked into a room where the energy was so thick, so unspoken, that you knew something was about to happen? That's what Meghan felt. That's what Anne embodied. Because reconciliation wasn't just an option on that day, it was an ultimatum. On one side of the table sat Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the self-exiled duo who had traded palace halls for Montecito mansions. They carried with them the weight of accusations, documentaries, memoirs, and public fallout. Every glance between them and the rest of the family was steeped in history, a history that could not be erased by polite greetings. On the other side sat Charles, William, and Anne, flanked by advisors who said nothing but observed everything. The air was polite, yes, but it was a politeness laced with ice. And here's where the cracks began to show. Meghan entered the room with her familiar Hollywood polish. Head high, posture perfect, every detail of her presentation carefully chosen. The hairstyle sleek, the expression controlled. But her eyes gave her away. They darted quickly, scanning, calculating. This was not a woman stepping into reconciliation with open arms. This was a woman entering a chess match. And she knew that across the table sat an opponent who could not be dazzled. Because there sat Princess Anne. No smile. No pleasantries beyond the bare minimum. And, the most seasoned royal of them all, the woman who had lived her entire life under scrutiny and yet never courted scandal. She didn't need cameras or headlines. Her power was quieter, sharper, unshakable. And Meghan knew it. Everyone in the room knew it. But why was this meeting happening at all? That's the question that hovers. Because reconciliation is rarely spontaneous in the monarchy. It's planned, discussed, dissected by aides and strategists. The official line? That the family wanted to explore pathways forward with Harry and Meghan. The unofficial truth? Pressure was mounting. Public criticism of the monarchy had grown. The narrative of division threatened the very image of unity the crown relies on. And so, a meeting was arranged. Not because love demanded it, but because survival did. And let's not forget the personal stakes. For Harry, this was a chance, perhaps the last chance, to prove he wasn't entirely cut off. For Charles, it was an opportunity to appear magnanimous, a father willing to bridge divides. For William, it was about control, ensuring the Sussexes didn't claw their way back into influence. And for Anne? For Anne, it was about duty. About standing guard at the gates of tradition and ensuring that no outsider, no matter how glamorous, was allowed to dismantle what generations had preserved. The opening exchanges of the meeting were strained but civil. "How are the children?" someone asked. A question that was less about Archie and Lilibet and more about avoiding the real issues at hand. Small talk about California weather, about charity events, about anything but the storm that had dragged them all into the room. The kind of chatter designed to lull, to soften. But no one was fooled. Because beneath every word was a subtext. You betrayed us. You embarrassed us. And now you want back in. And this is where we need to stop and ask, was this ever truly reconciliation? Or was it an ambush? Was Meghan brought into that room under the guise of healing, only to find herself judged, weighed, and ultimately discarded? Because as the meeting dragged on, the civilities started to crack. Charles, measured as ever, spoke of shared futures and family bonds. William, more curt, mentioned responsibilities and trust. But it was, and who didn't bother with diplomacy? Her silence was louder than any statement. Her eyes, fixed and cold, communicated what she didn't need to put into words. "Meghan, you don't belong here." And Meghan felt it. That's the thing. She felt it. Every polite phrase landed like a slap, every carefully chosen word like a veiled attack. She adjusted in her chair. She smiled, but it was thin, strained. Harry, seated beside her, shifted uncomfortably, torn between defending his wife and maintaining some semblance of peace. But he said nothing, and that silence hung heavier than any argument could. Now, think about the irony here. This was supposed to be a reconciliation meeting, yet every detail, every gesture, screamed the opposite. Reconciliation implies healing, but what unfolded looked more like a tribunal. Meghan wasn't embraced, she was examined. She wasn't welcomed, she was weighed. And as she realized this, her composure began to tighten. Her jaw clenched, her gaze sharpened, until finally, it happened. That infamous stare. But before we get there, let's hold on this moment. Because in that room, just before the stare, the stage was set perfectly. A family fractured, a duchess cornered, and a princess unflinching. History has shown us again and again that the monarchy doesn't forgive easily. It doesn't forget. And in that room, with centuries of portraits staring down, reconciliation died before it could even be born. And then, without a word, Meghan lifted her eyes. What came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. Princess Anne. The name alone carries a weight that Meghan Markle could never quite match inside the palace walls. To many, she's the forgotten royal. The one who doesn't grab headlines, who isn't splashed across glossy magazine covers, who doesn't chase cameras. But that's exactly the point, and doesn't need attention to wield power. She is power. Quiet, relentless, immovable. The kind of force that doesn't shout, but makes you feel the pressure all the same. And that's why Meghan's stare, that infamous glare thrown across the room during the reconciliation meeting, wasn't aimed at just anyone. It was aimed at Anne, the Princess Royal. The woman who has earned respect inside and outside the family in a way Meghan never could. Let's rewind for a moment. Who isn't really? Born the second child and only daughter of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, and has been royal from the moment she took her first breath. But unlike her brothers, unlike Charles, Andrew, or even Edward, and never wavered in her dedication to the crown. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She didn't complain. She simply got on with it. Engagement after engagement, duty after duty. No excuses, no shortcuts. and the public noticed. By the 1970s and 80s, and was already known as one of the hardest-working royals, clocking hundreds of appearances year after year. Now, compare that with Meghan, an outsider, an actress, a woman who married into the institution and thought she could bend it to her will. Meghan brought glamour, yes. She brought headlines, yes. But she also brought something and despised, drama. Because to Anne, duty was never about attention. It was about endurance. Quiet, stoic endurance. And in her eyes, Meghan was the opposite of that. Have you ever been in a room with someone who doesn't say much, but whose very presence makes you second-guess yourself? That's Anne. She doesn't need to raise her voice. She doesn't need to humiliate you with words. One look, one cold glance, and you know exactly where you stand. For Meghan, who thrived on performance and persuasion, that kind of opponent was terrifying. Because how do you win against silence? How do you spin against a woman who doesn't care about optics? And here's where it gets even more fascinating. And isn't just blunt, she's legendary for it. Palace insiders tell stories of her unfiltered comments, her refusal to play along with political correctness, her willingness to call things as she sees them. When asked about Harry and Meghan's Oprah interview, for instance, and didn't mince words in private circles, she allegedly dismissed it as self-indulgent. And that's the Anne Meghan faced across the table. Not just a royal, not just a relative, but a wall of steel with decades of loyalty backing her up. Let's dig deeper into the contrast here. Meghan's story was always about emotion. About feelings of being left out, misunderstood, unsupported. She wanted the world to empathize, to see her as the victim. And story? The opposite. And never asked for sympathy. She never played the victim card. Even when faced with hardships, like the 1974 attempted kidnapping when a gunman tried to abduct her on the Mall, and stood her ground. She famously told the man, "Not bloody likely." That's in a nutshell. Fearless, direct, unyielding. Now imagine Meghan trying to square off with that. Imagine her carefully calculated stares, her polished expressions, her theatrical pauses, landing on a woman who had faced armed attackers and didn't even flinch. To Anne, Meghan's tactics would have seemed laughable, and that's what made the tension between them so raw, so combustible. Meghan's power came from her ability to control narratives, to charm, to dramatize. Anne's power came from being unimpressed by all of it. So when Meghan's eyes met Anne's during that private meeting, it wasn't just a stare. It was a clash of worlds. The Hollywood Duchess versus the Iron Princess. Glamour versus grit. Performance versus principle. And everyone in the room knew that if Anne made up her mind, Meghan didn't stand a chance. But here's the kicker. Anne wasn't just another voice at the table. She was the voice. Charles may be king, William may be heir, but within the family, Anne's word carries an unspoken authority. She has been the late Queen's most trusted confidant, the sibling who never strayed, the one who never needed rescuing from scandal. If Anne said Meghan couldn't be trusted, that was it. Conversation over. And Meghan knew it. That's why her stare wasn't casual. It was calculated. A challenge. A dare. Because in Meghan's world, eye contact isn't just communication, it's a weapon. She wanted to rattle and to show defiance without speaking. But here's the irony. You can't rattle someone like Anne. And doesn't play those games. She's seen it all before. Royal drama, political scandal, tabloid circus. To her, Meghan was just the latest storm to weather. Nothing more, nothing less. And that's why this chapter of the story matters so much. Because if Meghan had thrown that stare at Charles, maybe it would have sparked guilt. If she had thrown it at William, maybe it would have triggered anger. But throwing it at Anne, that was like throwing water at stone. The stone doesn't move. The stone doesn't break. It simply reminds you of how fragile you are in comparison. Now let me ask you, who do you think the palace truly respects? The actress who gave interviews to Oprah? Or the princess who told a kidnapper, "Not bloody likely," and carried on with her life? Respect in the monarchy isn't earned through headlines. It's earned through survival. And has survived everything. And so, in that moment, when Meghan's eyes locked onto Anne's, the room froze. It wasn't just tension. It was recognition. Recognition that Meghan was out of her depth. Recognition that Anne wasn't going to blink. And recognition that this single moment would ripple far beyond the four walls of that meeting room. Because Anne, the unbreakable force, wasn't about to yield. Not to Meghan. Not to anyone. And as silence stretched across the room, one thought crystallized in Meghan's mind. She wasn't just up against a family. She was up against a fortress. But what came next would prove that even fortresses have their weapons, and Anne's silence was about to cut sharper than any sword. Silence. To most of us, silence is awkward. It's the space between words that makes us fidget, that forces us to fill the gap with chatter. But to Meghan Markle, silence was a tool, a weapon. And in that private meeting with the royals, silence became her armor. She knew every word she spoke would be dissected, twisted, and weaponized against her. So, she didn't give them words. She gave them something far more unnerving. Nothing. But here's the irony. In the monarchy, silence doesn't protect you. It condemns you. Because silence invites interpretation. And interpretation, inside palace walls, is often more dangerous than the truth. Picture the scene again. The table heavy with tension, princess and sitting like a sentinel of steel, Charles measuring every phrase, William avoiding Meghan's gaze. And then Meghan, back straight, jaw tight, eyes darting but lips unmoving. She listened. She observed. She didn't jump in to defend herself. She didn't protest. She didn't plead. Instead, she sat in silence. And that silence was deafening. Now let's pause. Have you ever been in a conversation where someone refuses to answer, where they simply let the air thicken until everyone else becomes uncomfortable? That was Meghan's strategy. She knew that sometimes the less you say, the more power you project. But here's the contradiction. While Meghan believed her silence made her seem composed and untouchable, the royals saw it as insolence, as arrogance, as proof she wasn't willing to bend, to compromise, to submit. And this is where the clash of cultures becomes impossible to ignore. In Hollywood, silence can be mysterious, dramatic. It makes the audience lean in, waiting for your next line. But in the monarchy, silence can look like defiance. It can look like contempt. And in a family where hierarchy is everything, contempt is unforgivable. So why did Meghan stay silent? Because she knew she couldn't win the conversation. If she spoke, she'd be accused of being too emotional, too defensive, too outspoken. If she lashed out, she'd be branded ungrateful. If she softened, she'd be called manipulative. Every path was a trap, so she chose the only option that felt safe. Say nothing at all. But here's where it gets fascinating. Silence can be read in two ways. To Meghan, it was control. To Anne, Charles, and William, it was proof. Proof that Meghan wasn't there to reconcile, that she wasn't willing to engage in the give and take of family healing. Proof that she was waiting, calculating, watching, like a predator choosing its moment. And in the monarchy, perception matters more than reality. Let's not forget. Meghan has always been a performer. That's not an insult. It's a skill. She knows how to hold a pause, how to use her face when her words fail. In that room, she leaned on her training. Every silence was deliberate. Every smile was tight and controlled. Her eyes did the talking, flitting to Harry for support, narrowing when Anne shifted in her seat, flashing briefly at Charles as if daring him to confront her directly. It was theater, and the audience was her in-laws. But here's the twist. Meghan miscalculated. Because Anne wasn't an audience. Charles wasn't an audience. William wasn't an audience. They weren't waiting for a performance. They were waiting for submission. And submission never came. Now think about Harry here. His role in this silence was complicated. He had grown up in these rooms, had watched arguments unfold and then vanish under the weight of unspoken rules. He knew silence could be survival. But watching Meghan use it so deliberately must have shaken him. Because to the royals, his silence alongside hers looked like complicity, a united front of defiance. And that only hardened their resolve. Let's add a layer of history here. Silence has always been a weapon in the royal family. Queen Elizabeth mastered it. She never explained, never complained. But there's a difference between the Queen's silence and Meghan's. The Queen's silence was about dignity, about letting actions speak. Meghan's silence, in that meeting, was interpreted as disdain. The same tactic, two different readings. And that's why Meghan's silence backfired. Here's a question for you. Do you think Meghan truly believed silence would shield her? Or do you think she stayed silent because she had already accepted that nothing she said could change the outcome? That maybe, deep down, she knew the decision had already been made before she even walked in? Because palace insiders whisper that Meghan walked into that meeting already stripped of influence. The reconciliation was a formality, a last-ditch performance of fairness. The royals weren't looking to bring her back into the fold. They were looking for confirmation that they were right to exclude her. And her silence gave them that confirmation. But silence doesn't just protect, it provokes. The longer Meghan stayed quiet, the more and bristled. The more William's jaw tightened. The more Charles leaned into formal platitudes instead of fatherly warmth. Meghan's silence filled the room with unease, and unease turned to frustration. Until finally, her silence turned into something far more explosive, the stare. Because when words fail, when silence no longer carries the weight you want, there's only one tool left: the eyes. And Meghan's eyes spoke volumes. Her silence wasn't empty, it was the calm before the storm. And so, just when the room thought her quiet had dulled the edge of conflict, Meghan looked up. Her gaze locked onto Anne's. And silence became fury. But what happened next didn't just shatter the silence. It shattered the illusion of reconciliation itself. And no one saw it coming. It wasn't a glance. It wasn't a fleeting look, the kind you throw across a room when you're distracted or bored. No, Meghan Markle's eyes, in that moment, were weapons, fixed, sharp, and unflinching. This was the infamous death stare. A look that insiders later described as colder than the marble walls of the palace itself. A look that froze everyone in that private meeting and left even those who despised Meghan speechless. But let's slow this down, because this moment demands precision. Picture the scene once more. The air already thick from hours of strained conversation. Words had been spoken, but they meant nothing. Meghan's silence had already unsettled the room, and had remained stoic, unwavering, her legendary steel demeanor unbothered by the Duchess across the table. And then, like lightning breaking the stillness, Meghan's eyes rose and locked onto Anne's. It wasn't just a look. It was defiance condensed into a single gesture. It was years of resentment, humiliation, and bitterness compressed into one piercing glare. Her lips didn't move, but her eyes screamed, "I see you. I'm not afraid of you. And I'll never bow to you." Have you ever experienced that kind of stare? The kind that makes you question if you've just been challenged, insulted, or threatened, all without a single word being spoken? That's what it felt like in that room. Now, why does a stare matter? Because in royal history, gestures are everything. Think of Diana's shy tilt of the head, of Elizabeth's subtle wave, of Charles's careful clasped hands. Body language is political currency in the monarchy. Every move is dissected, every signal amplified. And here was Meghan, deliberately breaking every unspoken rule of royal etiquette. No softness, no deference, no polite avoidance. Just a stare so brutal it could cut glass. And here's where the tension doubled. Princess Anne, known for her own icy glares, did not look away. That's the part most people miss. This wasn't Meghan throwing a look and dismissing it. This was a battle. Eyes locked, neither willing to blink, neither willing to concede ground. And the silence around them became unbearable. Even Harry, sitting inches away, shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the two women as if waiting for one of them to detonate. Insiders say you could almost hear the tick of the antique clock on the mantel. Every second stretched into eternity as Meghan's stare burned into, and Anne's stare shot right back. It wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was a symbolic war. Meghan represented the outsider who challenged tradition, the rebel who dared to say the monarchy was outdated and oppressive, and represented centuries of duty, sacrifice, and loyalty to the institution. Their locked eyes became a metaphor for the entire royal crisis. Modernity versus tradition, Hollywood versus heritage, rebellion versus endurance. And let's not forget the others in the room. Charles, the king, caught between paternal instinct and royal duty, reportedly cleared his throat but said nothing. William, future king, clenched his jaw so tightly aides later said his temple throbbed red. Advisors sat frozen, unsure if they were witnessing a minor spat or the moment that would seal Meghan's exile forever. The death stare was more than defiance. It was a declaration. Meghan was telling them all, without a syllable, "You may take my role, my titles, my standing, but you will never break me." But here's where it gets chilling. In the monarchy, gestures aren't just symbolic, they're remembered. They're cataloged. They're whispered about behind gilded doors. And this stare, this brazen act of silent defiance, was logged not just in memory, but in consequence. Because in that instant, Anne's mind was made up. This wasn't just a difficult duchess. This wasn't just a rebellious in-law. This was a threat to the stability of the family itself. And when Anne makes up her mind, there's no undoing it. Now let's zoom out. Across history, the royals have relied on gestures to signal intent. Remember when Diana's head dipped low during Charles's speeches, signaling both submission and quiet rebellion? Or when Elizabeth wore brooches as coded messages during state visits? Meghan's stare joined that legacy, but in the darkest possible way. It wasn't a subtle signal. It was open warfare. And once it happened, there was no walking it back. Let me ask you directly, do you think Meghan meant to provoke Anne in that moment? Or do you believe it slipped out, an uncontrollable burst of anger, betrayal, and pride? Because here's the twist. Some insiders argue Meghan calculated the stare, rehearsed it even, as a way of reclaiming control in a room where she felt cornered. Others say it was instinctual, raw emotion spilling out. Either way, the damage was irreversible. Because what happened next wasn't loud. It wasn't a shouting match, no slammed doors, no raised voices. It was worse. It was the kind of quiet reaction that carries more weight than any outburst. And didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She didn't mutter a word. She simply sat there, letting Meghan's stare meet the wall of her own. And in that silence, Anne won. Because here's the thing. In the royal family, endurance always trumps drama. Drama fades. Outbursts pass. But endurance, stoic, unbothered endurance, always wins the long game. Meghan's stare may have made headlines later, but in that room, in real time, it was Anne's refusal to respond that sealed the outcome. Meghan's defiance was loud, and silence was louder. And this is why the death stare became the symbol of the entire meeting. Because in that one gesture, reconciliation died. The royals didn't need to hear Meghan's words to know where she stood. They saw it in her eyes. And once they saw it, they knew Meghan could no longer hold a role in the monarchy. But the fallout didn't stop there. Because once whispers of the stare leaked out of the palace, the press seized on it. Headlines screamed of confrontation. Body language experts were dragged onto television to analyze every angle of Meghan's glare. The world became obsessed with deciphering that moment. And while Meghan may have thought the stare gave her strength, the narrative spun against her. Suddenly, she wasn't the victim. She was the aggressor. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest twist of all. Because what Meghan believed was power became the very proof the royals used to sideline her completely. And yet, even as the fallout spread, one question lingered. Who leaked the story? Who whispered of the death stare to the outside world? Because that leak would ignite the palace whisper network, and the consequences would spiral further than anyone in that room imagined. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Whispers. That's how the palace really works. Not grand declarations. Not public statements. Not even official briefings. No, inside those gilded halls, power moves on whispers. Quiet words passed from one aide to another, murmurs traded in corridors, sly comments overheard at cocktail parties. And after Meghan Markle's infamous death stare at Princess Anne, those whispers became thunder. Because here's the thing. No matter how private the meeting was meant to be, nothing inside the monarchy ever stays truly private. The walls themselves seem to have ears. Staff gossip, courtiers talk, aides compare notes, and before long, a single moment becomes a narrative. And in this case, that narrative was devastating for Meghan. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever told one person a secret, and then, somehow, days later, people you barely know repeat it back to you? That's what it's like in the palace. A look exchanged across a table doesn't stay in that room. It filters through assistants, bodyguards, secretaries, until it lands in the ears of those who know exactly how to spin it. And this is where Meghan's death stare took on a life of its own. Inside the palace, it wasn't just described as a glare. It was called disrespect. It was called insolence. Some even whispered the word threat. Can you imagine that? A stare, just a stare, being cast as a threat to the monarchy itself. Yet that's how the narrative began to form. Because perception is everything. And perception inside those walls was turning against Meghan fast. Now think about who benefits from these whispers. That's the real question. Was it Charles, eager to solidify control by painting Meghan as unruly? Was it William, determined to keep his brother and sister-in-law from regaining any foothold? Or was it Anne herself, though she hardly needed to whisper? Her reputation alone carried more weight than words. Whoever started it, the whispers moved like wildfire. And it wasn't long before the whispers escaped the palace and reached the media. Suddenly, tabloids were hinting about tensions in a private reconciliation meeting. Anonymous sources spoke of icy exchanges and a confrontation that silenced the room. The phrase death stare hadn't even been coined yet, but the groundwork was being laid. Let me ask you, do you think Meghan realized, in that very moment, that the walls were closing in? Or do you think she believed she could control the narrative once the whispers spread? Because Meghan had mastered media manipulation before. Leaks and counter-leaks had always been her battleground. But this time was different. This time, the whispers weren't working in her favor. And here's where it gets darker. The royals don't need to scream or shout to destroy someone. They don't need public confrontations. All they need are whispers, tiny, cutting seeds of doubt planted in the right ears. She was disrespectful. She doesn't understand duty. She glared at, and as if challenging her. One whisper here, another whisper there. Until suddenly, it's no longer rumor, it's fact. And Meghan became the villain of a story she couldn't rewrite. But here's the contradiction. Whispers don't just hurt, they spread curiosity. By the time the story leaked into public discourse, everyone wanted to know exactly what happened in that room. And the lack of concrete detail only made the whispers louder. Was Meghan truly hostile? Did Anne glare back? Did Harry try to intervene? The lack of clarity fed the frenzy, and the frenzy only served to isolate Meghan further. Now, let's not forget the emotional toll of this whisper network. For Meghan, who had already accused the palace of briefing against her, the spreading narrative confirmed her worst fears. She wasn't just facing a family divided. She was facing an institution united in silent sabotage. For Harry, it was agony. His wife was being painted as insubordinate, disrespectful, even dangerous. And he knew exactly how these whispers worked. He had watched them destroy his mother, Princess Diana, piece by piece. And now it was happening again. But this time, there was one crucial difference. Diana's whispers painted her as unstable, emotional, fragile. Meghan's whispers painted her as cunning, cold, and defiant. And in some ways, that was even worse. Because fragility might invite sympathy. But defiance? Defiance invited punishment. And punishment is exactly what came next. Because once the whispers solidified into consensus, action followed. Meghan wasn't just disliked. She wasn't just controversial. She was dangerous to the unity of the monarchy. And that's when the royals made their decision. A decision that would strip Meghan of her role once and for all. But before we get to that, let's linger on the whispers themselves. Imagine aides whispering in corners. Did you see her eyes? Imagine advisors meeting late at night. This cannot continue. Imagine Anne herself, in her clipped, blunt tone, muttering, "She's not fit for this." These whispers didn't just tell a story, they created one. And once created, there was no undoing it. And so the death stare, already infamous, became more than a moment. It became a weapon used against Meghan. A piece of evidence in the palace's case to remove her. Proof, they said, that she could never truly reconcile. But here's the chilling question. If whispers can build narratives this strong, what happens when the whispers turn into decisions? Because that's exactly what came next. And no one saw it coming. When the royal family decides to act, they don't slam doors or raise voices. They don't call emergency press conferences. They do something far more ruthless. They strip quietly. They erase silently. And they make sure that by the time the public realizes what has happened, the decision is already irreversible. That's exactly what Meghan Markle faced after her infamous death stare at Princess Anne. Because soon after that meeting of supposed reconciliation, whispers hardened into something else. Action. The royal family, long accused of dithering and dragging their feet, moved with icy precision. Meghan's role, the last symbolic thread tying her to the inner circle, was about to be cut. But what role was that exactly? That's where the story gets slippery, because it wasn't a simple matter of titles or medals. Meghan had already lost the right to use Her Royal Highness years earlier, after stepping down with Harry. She had already forfeited military patronages, state duties, the ability to represent the crown on official business. What she still held, however, was influence. a shadow of connection, the quiet privilege of being able to claim she was still part of the family's machinery, even from afar. She was still, technically, the Duchess of Sussex, still listed on patronage rosters, still whispered about in palace corridors as a question mark. And that's what the royals decided to erase. Think about how brutal that is. You walk into a meeting under the impression it's about healing, about finding a way back, about reconciliation. You leave having unknowingly signed away your last shred of influence. That was Meghan's fate. Because while she may have thought she was holding her ground with silence and stares, the royals were already drafting the paperwork to push her further out. The palace has its own language for this process. They don't say, "We're stripping her role." They use words like streamlining, adjustments, clarity. But behind the sterile language lies a simple truth. Meghan's remaining roles were reassigned. Patronages she still nominally held were quietly redistributed to working royals. Invitations that might have included her name suddenly disappeared. Projects once branded with her involvement were scrubbed. It wasn't a public beheading, it was death by erasure. Now let's pause. Imagine what that feels like. Have you ever been quietly removed from something without explanation? Maybe a work project, maybe a family event. You find out not because someone told you directly, but because you're simply not there anymore. Your name disappears from the list. Your chair is gone from the table. That's what Meghan experienced. Only in her case, the world was watching. And here's where the symbolism becomes unavoidable. Stripping roles in the royal family isn't just about logistics. It's about hierarchy. It's about telling the world, this person is no longer one of us. Think back to Edward VIII, whose abdication stripped him not just of the crown, but of his standing. Think of Andrew, whose scandals cost him military patronages and the respect of the armed forces. And now Meghan, a duchess still in name, but hollow in reality. Of course, the palace would never admit that the death stare triggered this decision. Officially, it was all part of the natural evolution of roles. Unofficially, insiders whispered that Meghan's stare at and was the last straw. That it proved once and for all she wasn't willing to bend, wasn't willing to show deference, wasn't willing to play the role of a supporting player in a monarchy that demands loyalty above all else. And here's the irony. Meghan likely thought her silence and stare projected strength. But to the royals, it screamed incompatibility. To them, her behavior wasn't strength, it was rebellion. And rebellion in the monarchy doesn't just get punished. It gets erased. Let's talk about Harry here, because his position in all of this is crucial. Harry was torn. Stripping Meghan of her role meant stripping him, too, by extension. He may not have been the target that day, but he felt the blade all the same. For him, it wasn't just about roles and titles. It was about love. Watching his wife be erased from the fabric of the family confirmed every fear he'd voiced in interviews and memoirs. That the institution would never truly accept Meghan. That they would rather cut him out than welcome her in. But the decision went ahead. Roles reassigned. Meghan's presence diminished. And when the news finally trickled to the press, it was spun as inevitability. The Duchess of Sussex has formally stepped back. Patronages reassigned to working royals. Bland headlines for a brutal reality. The death stare had birthed consequences Meghan couldn't undo. Now ask yourself, was this fair? Was Meghan punished too harshly for a single look, a single gesture in a single meeting? Or was the stare simply the spark that ignited years of frustration? Because make no mistake, this wasn't just about one moment. This was about years of tension, years of whispers, years of Meghan challenging the family's unspoken rules. The stare was just the symbol that made it impossible to ignore any longer. And this is where the betrayal cuts deepest. Because the meeting had been framed as reconciliation, healing, finding common ground. But instead of reconciliation, Meghan walked away diminished. Instead of healing, she walked away erased. And instead of common ground, she left knowing the palace had closed ranks against her once and for all. But here's the twist. Meghan wasn't about to fade quietly. If the royals thought stripping her role would silence her, they were wrong. Because Meghan had her own weapons. The media, her allies, her ability to tell her side of the story. And as the palace celebrated its quiet erasure, Meghan was already plotting her countermove. And that countermove would shock the royals in ways they didn't expect. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The cameras lied. They always do. Outside the palace walls, the public saw the polished facade. Staged smiles, carefully chosen outfits, brief flashes of civility captured by long lenses. But inside was fury. The kind of fury that simmers beneath the skin, masked for the world but impossible to ignore when the doors closed and the photographers were gone. That's what made the aftermath of Meghan's role being stripped so unnerving. On the surface, the monarchy projected unity. The king spoke of family bonds. William and Catherine appeared at charity events with serene smiles. Even Anne, the woman at the center of Meghan's infamous stare, carried on with her usual blunt efficiency, shaking hands and cutting ribbons as though nothing had happened. But behind the curtain, the meeting had cracked something open, and Meghan's fury, suppressed in silence during the encounter, was now a fire threatening to burn everything in its path. Let's pause. Have you ever had to sit through a family event, holding your tongue, putting on a fake smile, while inside you seethed? That's what Meghan did during those reconciliation optics. She played the role. She nodded at the right moments. She walked beside Harry, back straight, head high, the very picture of composure. But the truth? Inside she was boiling, and the royals knew it. The fury wasn't just about losing her role. It was about the hypocrisy. Think about it. Meghan had been brought in under the promise of reconciliation. The palace had whispered of second chances, of healing divides. Yet instead of a path forward, she was met with cold stares, stripped patronages, and whispers that painted her as defiant and dangerous. To Meghan, it wasn't just betrayal, it was entrapment. She believed she had walked into a trap disguised as a peace offering. Now here's where the contradiction deepens. Publicly, Meghan had to remain polished. Every appearance mattered. Every gesture was analyzed. If she looked too angry, she would be branded unstable. If she looked too calm, she would be branded manipulative. So she perfected a new mask. A faint smile, controlled posture, a veneer of grace. And yet, her eyes told the real story. Paparazzi photos captured moments where the mask slipped, the jaw tight, the lips pressed thin, the gaze a fraction too sharp. Those who knew how to read her saw it instantly. She was furious. Inside the palace, Meghan's fury became a subject of speculation. Advisors whispered, would she retaliate? Would she leak? Would she go nuclear in the press? And that fear gnawed at them, because they knew Meghan's greatest weapon wasn't a title, a patronage, or a royal duty. It was her voice. And if her fury translated into another tell-all interview or Netflix documentary, the monarchy would be thrown back into crisis. Harry's fury, however, was quieter. He wasn't the one glaring across the table or radiating defiance through silence. His fury was buried under guilt. He had brought Meghan back into that lion's den. He had told her reconciliation was possible. And instead, she had been humiliated. Harry's silence in that meeting, the same silence that had seemed so calculated, now haunted him. Because in Meghan's eyes, silence looked a lot like betrayal. But here's the chilling part. While Meghan and Harry wrestled with their private anger, the monarchy presented a picture of calm. The more Meghan boiled, the calmer and appeared in public. The more Harry seethed, the more William projected steadiness. It was psychological warfare at its finest. One side carefully hiding their fury, the other side forced to wear their mask tighter and tighter until it cracked. And it did crack. Reports soon surfaced of Meghan snapping at aides in Montecito, of tense arguments with Harry behind closed doors, of furious late-night phone calls with her remaining allies in Britain. Every whisper that emerged painted a picture of a woman cornered, betrayed, and ready to fight back. Whether those whispers were true or strategically planted hardly mattered. What mattered was the perception. And perception, as always, was everything. Now, let me ask you directly, which image do you think the public believed? The serene facade of a calm, united royal family? Or the whispers of Meghan's private fury? Because history tells us this. When the palace controls the narrative, outsiders rarely win. And this is where the tragedy deepens. Meghan's fury, justified or not, played directly into the monarchy's hands. Every time she tightened her jaw, every time she looked resentful in a candid photo, it reinforced the image of a woman who couldn't adapt, couldn't accept, couldn't reconcile. It turned her fury into their weapon. But what about behind the palace walls? What did the royals truly feel after that meeting? And, characteristically, dismissed it all with bluntness. She had seen too many storms to be rattled by one duchess's glare. William, however, saw it differently. For him, Meghan's fury wasn't just personal, it was a political liability. He feared her wrath would spill into the public again, poisoning the monarchy's image. Charles, he walked a tightrope. Fatherly instinct tugged at him, but kingly duty overrode it. He couldn't risk Meghan's fury undermining his reign. And so he retreated, projecting calm in public while hardening his stance in private. But the most devastating truth? Meghan's fury didn't just isolate her from the royals. It began to isolate her from Harry. Because while she raged, he withdrew. While she plotted countermoves, he sought peace. And for the first time, cracks appeared not just between Meghan and the family, but between Meghan and Harry themselves. And that's why the public facade versus private fury became the most dangerous game of all. Because behind every staged smile was a ticking time bomb. Behind every silent gaze was a threat of eruption. And when Meghan finally decided to unleash her fury publicly, the monarchy would have no choice but to strike back harder. But here's the cliffhanger. Meghan's fury didn't stay private forever. What came next would prove that the Duchess wasn't about to go quietly. She had a countermove, and it was aimed directly at the heart of the monarchy. And no one saw it coming. Countermoves. They're the backbone of Meghan Markle's survival strategy. Every time the palace tried to box her in, she found a way to break out. Every time the royals thought they had silenced her, she re-emerged louder, more visible, more disruptive. And after being stripped of her remaining role, after enduring whispers of defiance and the humiliation of the reconciliation meeting, Meghan's fury crystallized into action. This was the moment she decided. If they were going to push her out, she would push back harder. But how? That's the question. Because Meghan no longer had the trappings of royal power. No staff, no patronages, no official role. What she did have was the thing the monarchy feared most, the ability to tell her own story. The countermove wasn't going to happen behind palace walls. It was going to happen in public, where the monarchy had the least control. Let's stop here for a second. Have you ever been written off, told you no longer matter, only to realize the very act of exclusion gave you more freedom? That's exactly what Meghan realized. By stripping her of her role, the monarchy thought they were silencing her. Instead, they unshackled her. Because without the constraints of palace protocol, Meghan could speak more freely than ever. And she intended to. The first hints of her countermove came quietly. Subtle leaks to sympathetic journalists. Carefully crafted statements that seemed harmless on the surface, but carried daggers underneath. A friend close to Meghan would tell the press she had been blindsided by the stripping of her role. Another source whispered that Meghan had been treated with disdain during reconciliation. These weren't coincidences. They were calculated. Meghan was planting seeds, shaping the narrative before the palace could fully control it. But leaks alone weren't enough. Meghan knew she needed something bigger, something bold, something impossible to ignore. And that's when whispers began about a new project, a media venture, a sit-down interview, perhaps even a memoir of her own. The details were murky, but the message was clear. Meghan wasn't disappearing. She was recalibrating. Now let's consider the timing. The monarchy thrives on control. Every engagement, every speech, every public appearance is scheduled with military precision. Meghan's countermove threatened to disrupt that rhythm. By hinting at her next big revelation, she forced the royals into defensive mode. They had to prepare for the possibility that she would expose new secrets, air new grievances, or challenge their version of events. And in doing so, she regained leverage. Harry's role here was complicated, as always. Torn between his loyalty to Meghan and his deep, unshakable connection to his family, Harry became both ally and obstacle. On one hand, he supported Meghan's determination to fight back. On the other, he feared escalation. He knew the monarchy's retaliation would be swift and merciless. Insiders suggest Harry pleaded for caution, urging Meghan to think of the children, to avoid another public war. But Meghan was resolute. To her, silence meant surrender. And surrender was not an option. Let me ask you this. Do you think Meghan was reckless in plotting her countermove? Or was she simply playing the only card she had left? Because from her perspective, the monarchy had already taken everything. Reputation, role, influence, all gone. What did she have to lose? In her mind, the only way forward was through confrontation. And so the countermove took shape. Public appearances in America, carefully staged to contrast with her cold reception in Britain. Partnerships with high-profile allies, designed to remind the world of her influence. Whispers of tell-all content, whether through streaming platforms or trusted journalists. Meghan was reminding the royals of one simple truth. They might control the palace, but she controlled the global stage. Here's the irony. By trying to erase Meghan, the royals had inadvertently amplified her. Every time they stripped something away, she replaced it with something louder, bolder, harder to ignore. And the death stare, which the palace had used as evidence of her defiance, became her rallying cry. Supporters reframed it not as insolence, but as courage. They called her stare the look of a woman standing up against an institution that had tried to crush her. The monarchy's weapon was being turned against them. But the countermove didn't just stop with narrative control. Meghan also sought to expand her influence in areas the monarchy couldn't touch: politics, entertainment, and activism. While and carried on with ribbon cuttings and Charles delivered speeches about tradition, Meghan was building platforms, forging alliances, and inserting herself into global conversations. The royals may have stripped her role, but she was constructing a new one, and one they couldn't take away. Still, the danger was obvious. Every countermove Meghan made risked escalating the feud. Every public jab invited retaliation. And the monarchy had its own arsenal. Leaks, briefings, subtle but devastating narratives planted in the press. What Meghan saw as defiance, the palace painted as arrogance. What Meghan saw as courage, they spun as selfishness. The war of narratives intensified, and once again, Harry and Meghan found themselves at the center of a storm. And yet, Meghan pressed on. Because in her mind, the alternative was worse. To do nothing would be to accept exile. To remain silent would be to confirm the palace's version of the story. And Meghan Markle, the actress who once clawed her way from obscurity to stardom, was never going to fade quietly into the background. But here's the cliffhanger. For all her confidence, for all her calculated moves, Meghan underestimated one thing: princess, and wasn't done. And when and finally decided to respond, it wouldn't be with whispers. It would be with words sharp enough to cut through every countermove Meghan had made. And what came next would prove devastating. Princess and rarely speaks. That's part of her power. While others in the royal family have courted attention, indulged in interviews, or let their tempers slip, and has remained a fortress. She doesn't leak. She doesn't explain. She doesn't complain. And yet, when she does decide to speak, when she finally lets her words slip into the public domain, they carry the weight of a hammer blow. That's why Meghan's countermove, bold and carefully orchestrated as it was, triggered something extraordinary. And's final word. It didn't come in the form of a press conference, and would never stoop to that. It didn't come through tabloid leaks, either. That's not her style. And's words landed in the way she has always communicated, with blunt, piercing simplicity, spoken at just the right time, in just the right place, to just the right audience. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To understand the devastation of Anne's final word, you need to understand her reputation inside the monarchy. She's not just Charles's sister. She's not just the Queen's daughter. She is the monarchy's most unyielding defender. For decades, and has been the one family member who never faltered. No scandals, no breakdowns, no betrayals, just duty. Relentless, unforgiving duty. And that's why when she speaks, it isn't dismissed as gossip. It's treated as gospel. So imagine the weight of what happened after Meghan launched her countermove. The leaks, the staged appearances, the hints of new projects designed to reassert her influence. Meghan believed she was reclaiming ground, and saw it as confirmation of everything she already thought: that Meghan wasn't interested in family or reconciliation, that Meghan wasn't loyal to the crown, that Meghan was, and always had been, a threat to stability. And then, one evening, during an engagement that seemed routine, a speech at a charity function, attended by dignitaries and covered by the press, and delivered her verdict. She didn't name Meghan outright. She didn't need to. Instead, she spoke about loyalty, about service, about how some people mistake publicity for purpose. The room froze. Reporters scribbled. The message was unmistakable. This was Anne's word, her judgment, delivered with the subtlety of a dagger slid between the ribs. Have you ever been in a room when someone drops a line so sharp, so perfectly timed that everyone instantly knows who it's aimed at, even without a name being spoken. That's what it did. Her final word was a masterclass in controlled condemnation. By speaking in generalities, she avoided scandal. By delivering it with her usual blunt tone, she gave it credibility. And by leaving Meghan unnamed, she ensured the press would do the heavy lifting of interpretation. The fallout was immediate. Headlines the next morning blared with speculation. Anne's thinly veiled attack on Meghan. Princess Royal speaks of publicity over duty. Columnists dissected every syllable. Body language experts analyzed the set of Anne's jaw. And within hours, Meghan's countermove had been drowned out by Anne's words. Here's why it mattered. For years, Meghan's critics had painted her as self-serving, more interested in fame than duty. But those critics were outsiders, commentators, pundits. When and echoed that sentiment. Even obliquely, it wasn't just criticism. It was canon. If Anne, the most respected royal alive, implied Meghan was all publicity and no purpose, then the monarchy had effectively stamped that label on her forever. And the effect on Meghan? Crushing. Her countermove, meant to reassert power, suddenly looked petty by comparison. Her projects seemed hollow. Her appearances looked staged. Because Anne's words reframed everything Meghan did. The narrative had shifted again, and this time, it was nearly impossible to undo. Harry, caught in the middle as always, was devastated. To him, Anne's words weren't just an attack on Meghan. They were an attack on his family, his children, his choices. He reportedly confronted aides, furious that Anne had spoken so openly, even in veiled terms. But the damage was done. Harry's outrage only amplified the story, confirming to the public that Anne's words had struck exactly where they were meant to. And here's where it gets truly fascinating. Anne didn't speak again. She didn't elaborate. She didn't retract. She simply moved on, carrying out engagements as though nothing had happened. That's her genius. By saying little, by leaving space for interpretation, she gave the story room to grow without her. Meghan might rant, Harry might protest, commentators might speculate, but Anne remained silent. Untouchable. Her single word lingered, echoing louder than 1,000 interviews ever could. Now, ask yourself, do you think Meghan underestimated Anne? Did she think Anne was too reserved, too restrained, to ever speak publicly against her? Because if so, she miscalculated badly, and had been silent through decades of drama. But she chose this moment to speak. And when she did, she didn't just counter Meghan's moves, she obliterated them. And yet, for all the devastation Anne's words caused, they also sparked something new. Meghan, cornered once again, faced a choice: retreat into silence, or escalate even further. If Anne thought her final word would end the conflict, she may have misjudged Meghan's resilience. Because Meghan wasn't just humiliated, she was enraged. And rage, for Meghan, was always the spark of another move. But what came next would show the royals that Meghan still had cards left to play. And this time, she was willing to risk everything. And no one saw it coming.